Today, I made my living writing and talking about cruises, but just over a decade ago, I took my first trip ever. And there's plenty that I remember thinking before the first cruise that was just plain wrong, and other things that I just had no idea about. That's why I'm pulling back the curtain and sharing what no one told me before I took my first cruise. Before I dive in, Cruzely is coming up on a huge milestone, 100,000 subscribers. So if you learned something from this video or find it helpful, I hope that you'll subscribe and help reach that 100K goal. Go back with me to 2013 and my first cruise ever, where I learned my first important lesson. Now, my first cruise, it was actually a wedding present. I worked at this small company when I got married, and one of the bosses absolutely loved to cruise. As a gift, the company bought me a Royal Caribbean gift certificate worth $2,000. So I hop on the Royal Caribbean website and I see prices for cruises starting at just a few $100. I'm thinking they didn't get us one vacation, they bought us 3 or 4. But then I start to price things out. First, there's a double occupancy, so that price is doubled right off the bat. Then there are the taxes and fees, which thankfully will soon be included in the price. There's upgraded costs for nicer rooms and the required gratuities. That few $100 in cruise fare, it quickly bumped up against the value of the entire gift certificate, especially when you add in that onboard spending. Today, I know that the headline price is just the start of what you'll pay. I use something that I created called the rule of 2.5. Simply put, when you see a headline price for a cruise, multiply it by 2.5 off the bat to get an idea of what it will actually cost you. Change that to 3 or even 4 if you want to include onboard spending. So a cruise with a $500 price tag, it will actually be closer to $1,250 when it's all said and done. If it's your first time sailing, you might be overwhelmed with all of the different cruise lines to choose from. How do you know which one is right for you? I had no idea when I first sailed. I simply sailed Royal Caribbean because that's where I had the gift certificate to. Now I find it actually pretty easy to find the right fit. Having sailed just about all of the major lines, I figured out that the cruise line website, they're actually a really good proxy. While the images themselves are definitely done up for marketing, if you notice, they never show other people on the ship other than the focus of the shot, and everyone is also wonderfully attractive. These pictures are aimed to appeal to who the cruise line is built for. If you notice Celebrity, they feature images of people that are 40 years and older looking more affluent. Virgin has lots of trendy looking people on their website. Royal Caribbean, they show families and all the wild pool decks with things to do. Bottom line, if the images on the website catch your eye, then it's likely that the cruise line, it'll be a fit. One thing I didn't know before I sailed, how much the ship matters because you will spend the vast majority of your time on board. My first cruise was a 7-day cruise with 3 ports of call. Back then, I thought that meant 4 days at sea and 3 days in port. But days in port, they're only about 8 hours long. That means it's more like one entire day in port over the week and the rest of the time on the ship. That means the ship really matters to your cruise. Thankfully, we booked a newer ship at that time and it had a lot of things to do, but my next cruise, it was on an older vessel, and over the course of the trip, I actually got pretty bored, especially coming from a ship that had a lot more to do. Now, some people do like the older, smaller ships as they're more relaxed, they're easier to navigate, and they have fewer people on board. I'd suggest first-timers stick with the newer ships at first to get an idea of what a cruise can be. Then you can decide later if you want something less active. Food on any cruise is a big deal, and when I first sailed, I knew there were some paid spots and some restaurants included with the cruise fare. Given what I had already spent on the cruise, there was no way I was going to pay extra to eat in a specialty restaurant when there was already food included. I did that for a week, but ever since then, I've known that you have to mix it up some. The food in the buffet, it's serviceable, but I'll tell you that I'd never actually pay out of pocket to eat there on land. Eating there a couple of times a day for a week straight, that's pretty tough to me. The dining room, to me, it's a bit better, but I still find it hit and miss. Personally, some dishes I could eat every day, and others I never want to have again. However, I found specialty restaurants to be generally good overall. It helps that the dishes are prepared individually versus in mass quantities. I still hate having to pay that extra money, but it is a nice change of pace on a longer cruise. Speaking of eating, one thing that struck me as odd that first cruise, something pretty specific, but hopefully it can help you feel more confident. When you eat in a place like the buffet or the main dining room, there will be staff who either serve you or, in the case of the buffet, they clear your dishes and clean the table. At home, you'd normally sign a check and leave a tip as you leave a restaurant. But on a cruise, your gratuities are charged daily and distributed to the staff on your behalf. That means when you are done eating, you just get up and you walk out. I'll never forget my first cruise. All those years ago, looking around at other tables and eating kind of slow so that I could see what other people did before I just got up and left. Even if you've never sailed before, formal night might be something that you've heard about. There seems to be two camps on formal night, those who can't wait for it and those who absolutely dread it. If you're not looking forward to it because you don't want to get all dressed up, let me put you at ease. Before I took my first cruise, I thought that I'd have to wear a tux or a suit. Some people do, but if you're sailing a mainstream line like Carnival or Royal Caribbean, then don't worry, you don't have to go that far. As long as you look decent, you're fine on formal night. So a button-down shirt for guys and a nice blouse or a dress for the ladies. Of course, you can always go nicer if you want to. Avoid anything though, like ball caps or shorts or flip-flops, and it will be formal enough for formal night. Now, if you're on a higher end line, then the dress code, it may be more stringent. For most people though, formal night is more like not completely casual night. If there's one thing that jumped out to me after my first cruise, it's something that I never even considered before I stepped on board. And while it seems like it has gotten better over the years, the sales pitches, they may jump out to you too. You might think of your cruise fare as the cost of your cruise, but onboard spending is also a major source of revenue for the cruise companies. This includes everything from casino gambling to onboard shopping to buying drinks at the bar. What you'll find is that the cruise line, they aren't shy on sales pitches. Whether it's an announcement about sales or events, shopping guides for the ports, or coupons delivered to your door for things on board, you'll hear plenty about ways that you can spend money around the ship. Speaking of spending more money, shore excursions, they cost extra on your cruise. You may know that already. This is thankfully somewhere that I spent money on my first trip, and I learned very quickly that they are worth it. On that cruise, I took a tour into the jungles of Belize to see ancient Mayan ruins, followed by a boat ride back up the river where we saw monkeys and crocs and bats and all this other wildlife. More than a decade after that trip, I have never forgotten that excursion. That's why I always tell people to take at least one excursion every cruise. They simply give you a chance to do things that you cannot do back home, and it normally ends up being one of the most memorable parts of your vacation. Now, a little confession, when my wife and I got our cruise gift certificate as a wedding present, I have to admit that we both sort of looked at each other and cringed. Back then, I thought that cruising, frankly, was for old people. I can tell you firsthand that is not the case. If you take a Viking river cruise, then yes, it is going to be an older crowd, but your typical Caribbean trip, they run the gamut on board. There are kids, teens, honeymooners. There's bachelorette parties, middle-aged folks, and retirees. And if anything, I've noticed that cruises seem to be getting younger, or maybe I'm just getting older. And it's not just the age, the diversity on board is crazy. I just took a cruise from California to Mexico, and everyone was there. I'm talking black, white, Asian, Hispanic, straight, gay, young, old, everybody. I honestly can't think of any single place that's as diverse as on a cruise ship. All types seem to love it. So if you're thinking that you'll be the only young, left-handed redhead on the ship, that likely won't be the case. If you've never taken a cruise or never visited outside of the country, don't worry, you definitely will not be alone. There are newbies on every cruise. What you might be wondering about is getting by when in a foreign port. Now, if you've never traveled abroad, it can be intimidating, I understand. When it comes to cruises, however, you don't have anything to worry about if you're sailing in North America. Caribbean ports are heavily Americanized. Dollars are accepted everywhere, so you don't need to swap out money. English is widely spoken, so you won't have any trouble communicating either. It does make it really easy to get around and have a good time, though I will say that it can be a little disappointing that the ports don't feel as exotic as you might be expecting. Now, other parts of the world, they may be different for you, but given the popularity of cruises to the Caribbean, these destinations roll out the red carpet to make things easy. I mentioned before that different cruise lines, they have different personalities. It wasn't until I cruised a bit though that I realized that even different cruises themselves, even on the same cruise line, they can have their own personality as well. A week-long cruise to the Caribbean is a completely different atmosphere than a week-long cruise to Alaska, where things are much more subdued. A 3-day cruise from Miami, that will be different than a 7-day trip, even on the same line. As a shorter cruise, it will have more of a party atmosphere. I've even found that the vibes and the crowd, they can change from port to port. I mentioned how diverse the crowd sailing from California was. In Florida, you seem to get more younger adult passengers as cruising is just a way of life there. And in my home port of Galveston, the crowds seem more middle-aged and there's lots more families to me. I had no idea that there could be such a difference between ports, ships, and routes, but there definitely is. One thing that I didn't realize when I first sailed was that from that time on, taking a cruise would just get more and more popular. Today, cruising looks almost nothing like it did back then. There are more cruise lines, there's more cruise ships, there's bigger ships, and there are more people everywhere. For instance, that first cruise I took stopped in Roatan, where we were the only ship. It stopped in Belize, where again, we were the only ship. Cozumel was the busy port, and it had 5 ships in port that day, which is a decent amount, but all those ships were about half the size of today's vessels. Today, Nassau, it can welcome upwards of 30,000 passengers a day. There are new lines in the US market like MSC, Margaritaville, and Virgin Voyages. Some ports like Key West are even pushing back on cruise ships, and those spots that do welcome cruise passengers are getting more crowded. It's arguably the heyday of cruises right now, but I didn't realize back then just how much more popular that cruising would become. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you learned a thing or two before your first cruise. As well, you can learn more on everything cruising at Cruzely.com. And until next time, happy sailing.